we will deal with that. Okay. Okay. We're live. So, welcome everyone for tuning in. My name is Jeremy Mullally. I'm the writer and director of Capo, which is a feature film in development currently. If you're tuning in for the first time, this is a part of a ongoing live series that we've been doing, just documenting the process of the creation of Capo. So far, I've been talking about a lot of the work that's been done up to date, but we're also taking a day-to-day, week-to-week look behind the scenes on what's happening to get the project off the ground. And today's a very exciting day because it's really the first live stream I've done with a guest who you'll see on the screen right now. And that guest is a good friend of mine, David Szczecinski. David calls himself the behaviorist. He has a background in behavioral psychology. And he has been consulting on Capo for some time. I want to say probably at least over a year and a half, David, which we've been very fortunate to have him on, and he'll continue to do so, more so around the casting. And we're going to talk a bit about the collaboration that I've been very lucky to have with David on the project. But I want to stop yapping and introduce David. David, thanks so much for coming on the stream this morning.
Thank you, Jeremy, for having me. I'll just say one thing. I'm not a psychologist, just for all the psychologists out there. I have to clear that one up. But apart
No,
from that,
that's
yes,
important to
I'm
know.
a specialist in human behaviour, the biology of such. Yes.
Yeah, fantastic. And just for those who might not know you, you gave us a bit of detail there. Like, I'd love to just get a bit of your background so that people can appreciate the input that you have had on Capo as a really as a screenplay so far. So can you just give us sort of a quick look at your background, David?
Yeah, sure. I started in the military for 9 years, and then I became a private investigator when I left the army. That gave me a lot of started to give me a lot of insight into interesting people, shall we say. And after that, I became a mental health specialist, a mental health clinician, working for mental health services, rural and remote, at senior clinician, and at times on and off acting team leader. Then I went into private practice and started to explore the interpersonal neurobiology, Dr. Daniel Siegel's work, interpersonal neurobiology of behaviour, and started to really narrow down my clinical skills. And then I kind of went off the reservation a little bit and started to work with hypnosis, NLP, other things that influence how people behave. And then I took the natural progression of becoming a dating coach and relationship coach, working in the field with people, especially and in particular in body language and non-verbal skills. And after that, I started to look more at persuasion influence and started to run personal empowerment workshops around persuasion influence, training really for people who are disempowered or need to gain more confidence in that area. And now I'm a consultant on your film, Jeremy. Thank you very much. It's really wonderful process, and still working in the field of really the human nature. I'm also a published author. I'm available on Amazon. I've got the Hidden Nature series, you know, intimate partner profile series where I actually profile the biology of human beings and how they operate and what we call the default mode settings. In other words, the early life influences that lead them to make relationship choices and often unconsciously through what we call maps. So there's a whole series there of different profiles that I've created over the years to explain, what your perfect match might be, who might be a perfect match, and how you might go about meeting someone and connecting with them, and conversely, staying in that relationship. So there's quite a lot in what I do. That's the cliff notes. So yeah, does that answer your question, Jeremy?
Yeah, no, it does, and I'm glad you kind of touched on a lot of the different areas that you have touched on because like I want to give people like a good understanding of where you're coming from, especially because there's elements of that which I presume you were using when evaluating some of the characters in the screenplay when you had the opportunity to read it. And I kind of want to take us back to that point because I think it was around 2 years ago. I want to say at the like to towards the end of 2024, if I'm remembering that correctly, maybe midway through. And uh, I can't quite remember how it first began, but I know I wanted to speak to you just knowing. I think at the time you were still writing the series of books you mentioned, the intimate partner profiles, and there was elements to that which I was trying to draw on, insofar as like, and I've said it consistently on these lives as well, that um, the Capo is a very relationship driven film, and by that I mean like the drama is really dependent on the relationships between the different characters, especially obviously Alexander being the main character, the relationships that he has with all the different various people. And what I was wondering was when because film obviously is a creative medium, and this is a fictional story, but one of the benefits of speaking to you, David, was trying to get that consistency between reality, let's call it reality, through the work that you do. You're obviously working with people, you're going out in the field, you've done that in the past. How does that sort of how do you kind of bridge that gap between the fiction and the reality? Like what sort of things were you looking for, and did you identify when you were looking at the screenplay in your case?
For me, there's a difference between like book learning, like a diagnosis, that you might get for something, and real life. Real life's a little bit more complicated, and human beings are a conglomerate of different adaptabilities. So they adapt over time. Nothing's static. So when I was looking at the screenplay and looking at the characters, what I'm initially looking for is the vulnerabilities of certain characters and how those vulnerabilities might be exploited by other characters. So that gives me, as a profiler, because that's technically what I am these days, that gives me an understanding of what kind of profile each character might present with. Once I know the profile of the person, and this is like I do this in real life as well. Once I understand the profile, habits and patterns are how human beings operate. We're about 85 to 90% driven by our habits and patterns. So in reality, once I can identify a habit or a pattern, I can start to get an understanding of what that person might do, what they might say, where they might stand, how they might act. And it's not 100% correct all the time because there are different elements, or we call them different contexts to things. So when I was looking at the screenplay, I'm really looking at at the real life habits and patterns of human beings that have certain character traits or certain profiles, and how you have put that together in your screenplay. How you've made sense of that and understood it. Because once I start to read it, I get a picture in my mind of this profile that I might be looking at. And then I can sort of say, okay, this person will most likely say this, do that, act like this. This person might do the other thing. This person might be more likely to exploit someone, whereas this person might be more likely to caretake, because there's like 17 emotional drivers that human beings have that actually start to dictate the way that we respond and react to people throughout our lifetimes. Most of this stuff comes out of childhood genetics and modeling, from parents and significant others. So really, it's like a blueprint. I've got one of these kinds of brains that can kind of deconstruct everything and then put it back together again. So when I was looking at your script, Jeremy, I'm really deconstructing everything you've written and then putting it back
Mm.
together again as a profile. So every human being to me actually represents a type of profile. That profile is more or less predictable depending on circumstances. And then if you do something out of the box that say the profile might not do, then I look at that and go, okay, that's interesting. How might someone react to that? How might another character, say, react to that particular thing that was said or was done in that context, or not, and that kind of gives you that I don't know, that element of surprise, because like the jump scare, everyone's expecting the jump scare at a certain time, but it comes at another time. Aliens was original Aliens was a really good example of the director deciding not to tell the cast and crew about the stomach explosion, and
Mm.
so it was real genuine
Yeah.
fear on their faces when they saw it, and so that that's how I've been working with you. I was working with your script 2 years ago, and of course, characters evolve over time. I don't know how many changes to a script you've made, but they do
Too
evolve
many.
over time. The main thing is to take away that predictability, and it kind of that's or to enhance that predictability to a point where it becomes uncomfortable for an audience. So that they feel, oh my god, this guy's going to do this, or this person's going to do that. They're going to do that. They're going to do that. Is there relief when they do that? Most likely, but what if they don't? And so unpredictability is always unsafe, and we try and create or exert control in order to create predictability. And fear is the bottom element of that process. So we're creating a sense of tension all the time, and in your script, you're creating this nice sense of tension, and that's what we want. And so, as a profiler, I'm looking for all of those patterns, those habits, those little pathways that lead places, or maybe not.
Yeah, and like I like what you said before around there's predictability, and that's where the profiles come in handy because you're recognizing those continuous patterns. And I want to come back to it in a second because when I presume that when they act outside of that predictability, like you said, they do something outside of the box. It could be from something like covert influence that they're acting outside of that predictable. So I want to put a pin in that because we'll come back to it. Do want to talk about it. And but before we do that, can you just unpack a little bit of the profile that you see in Alexander? Obviously, I don't want to get too much in the weeds in order to give away the story. Like we want to keep some things hidden, I suppose. But just especially from the outset of the story, Alexander being the main character, can you talk a bit about what you identified around his profile, and are there sort of unique characteristics around it from the point of view of the age that he is, sort of being in that bracket of 20 years old and moving out of adolescence into adulthood? I was curious if that was something that was unique to his profile in that stage of development, I suppose.
Yeah. I I've developed my own profile, so I'll probably have to give a tiny bit of an explanation for the audiences to what
Yeah.
they look like, because they're not normal profiles. They're not like your disc profiles. They're not like the other psychological profiles. These profiles are purely based on your what we call your default mode settings from childhood, and how there's 16 patterns or behavioral traits generally that people can have that come out of that. And as we grow older, we start to adapt. So people aren't set; they're not fixed. Attachment theory suggests that we have this attachment style, and we kind of take that through our life, and that's great because we do. However, human beings are notoriously adaptable, so they will adapt depending on the need for resources. So all relationships are a negotiation of needs, and all human beings are vying for resources: physical, mental, emotional, financial, spiritual, cultural, sexual resources. So human beings are working in that's where I work in that biological level. So Alexander starts out really his life. He seemed to me to be quite introverted. So he starts out as a bit of a wolf profile. Now I have to explain the wolf
Yeah,
profile to you,
please do.
the
Yeah, yeah.
audience. The wolf profile is someone who can be a little. It can be quite, I guess, moralistic, quite set in their ways, quite introverted at times. They're a profile that usually stands by their values. They can be quite highly emotional. They can be quite a loner, like my lone wolf profile can be very much a loner, whereas my brooding wolf profile tends to be quite suppressive of their emotions, quite intellectual. and a little bit more outgoing and a bit more social. So Alexander to me started in this kind of when there's a lot more to the wolf. I mean, there's a whole book on it. There's in this profile, and as he you know as the story unfolds, and I don't know how much you've told the audience about the story, Jeremy, but as it unfolds,
Yeah.
he's very challenged in this profile because this profile doesn't like to take instructions from others. This profile is very much about independence and individuality and also protection. They like to protect everyone. I call it like a general caretaker kind of profile. Yet you've got this loner as well. So this person usually is fairly structured, and of course, as other characters come into play, it starts to really challenge his identity because really, what a profile is, it's an identity. And we all have these identities that we stick to, and then the identity starts to change over time depending on what's going on in our lives. In other words, we start to adapt. So he starts to take on a little bit more of what I might call a subtle profile, like a charm. Like I've got this category called a leisurely charmer, and I've got this category called a turbo charmer. Now, one of the leisurely charmer traits is to be quite influenced by other people at times, and just to want to keep, just to go with the flow, and just to want to keep everything peaceful, just to kind of be okay in life. And as he starts to get influenced by this other character on the situations in the screenplay, it starts to really challenge his identity. Now, wolves, they have a code, okay, and they follow their code. Now, their code isn't necessarily what I would say as a moral code. It's what I call the wolf code, which means if it's inside their code, they can do it if they perceive that it is justified to do. So Alexander's in this dilemma where his code might say one thing, but he's kind of being influenced in other areas to do other things and go against his code. So it's creating this huge identity crisis in this young
Yeah.
man.
And just to clarify, David, like the wolf code as you describe it, that can be quite separate to like a standard acceptable, like say ethical code in
Yes,
our society, right? Like it could be completely different.
absolutely. You'll see the wolf code everywhere. If you've ever met a bunch of army lads, they've got a code. It's their code, the
Yeah.
army code. Now, it's not necessarily the legal code. My female queen profile is much more about the legal code. They have rules. They follow rules. But wolves have a code, and it's like a code that's acceptable amongst most wolves. And you can break you can break the law if someone breaks the code. And
Mm, yeah.
that's why wolves get themselves into trouble, because they have a code that's okay. For example, more extreme wolf code might be, if someone hurt my family member, it's okay to hurt them, no problem. They wouldn't think twice about that. Now the law says no, you can't do that. But you get a pack of wolves together and they take out their own vigilante justice. So
Yeah.
when you've got a wolf that has a code against, say, non-violence, for example, because the wolf code can vary amongst different groups of these individual profiles, yet they're being influenced in a certain way where they've got to go against their code. It creates such a dilemma in them that you'll literally see a breakdown. And wolves go, one of two ways. They either go the brooding wolf, they become very depressed, very down, very suicidal, very, they're not well, or they become the
Mm,
lone wolf and they become more extreme. So the lone wolf is much more likely to start to do more extreme things. And they're a very interesting profile because they're on the more extreme end of the spectrum, whereas the caretaker kind of wolves, my brooding wolves, the caretaker wolves, which Alexander is in that category, right? He's in that category. He's trying to find out who harmed his father. So he's he's literally got this code and he's following his code, and then suddenly, well, not suddenly, over time, something happens to really challenge that, and now he's struggling. He's got to make sense of all of this, and of course he's led down certain paths that may lead to certain things that are probably very unpleasant. And of course,
Yeah.
in that whole thing is literally a deconstruction of Alexander and a reconstruction.
Yeah, and just to give those who are watching this maybe a clearer picture on what those two profiles, the brooding versus the lone wolf, would be like in films that we're aware of. Like, would you say, for example, a lone wolf would be someone like Travis from Taxi Driver, Travis Bickle, if you've seen that, and
Yeah.
I can't think of a brooding wolf. Perhaps you've got an example that might be a good example for a brooding wolf.
Well, brooding. I'm just thinking because yeah, my head's not sort of switched on today to other movies.
Yeah,
Uh, yeah, a brooding wolf is kind of your quintessential kind of lad that might sit at the bar drinking whiskey, saying to the rest of the world, "Leave me alone. Don't come anywhere near me."
yeah,
Brooding wolves. You often see the brooding teenager. So in films
mm,
where you've got the moral code that the wolf has, or the moral code that society has, sorry, versus the code that they have. And of course, the brooding wolf will constantly go around in a place where it's like literally an oppressive atmosphere around them. So, can you think of anyone like that, Jeremy, in a movie?
not off the top of my head, but let me come back to it because I'm sure by the time we get to the end of this
Yeah,
conversation, I
there's
certainly
plenty
will.
of brooding wolf
Uh,
characters definitely out there.
yeah,
I just can't think of any because
absolutely.
I haven't looked at the
I'm waiting
movie.
to,
That's one.
and I'm waiting just like you. I'm waiting to wake up as well. So maybe I'll wake up in the next 10 minutes.
Well, I've got my coffee
But
in
it
today.
yeah, that's an interesting apparatus to drink coffee from. But I love it. Can I ask you, David, because you're leading really well into it around the covert influence, like both from the outset, can you explain what covert influence is? Because the reason it's interesting to us from the point of view of the Capo is I would say probably one of the primary points of drama in the film derives from that very well clear to us as the audience, but maybe not so clear to Alexander of
Mm.
that influence that is being displayed or implemented by Professor Priestley, who was our main antagonist in the film, over Alexander. To go back, can you just explain a bit what covert influence is and what it looks like?
Absolutely. So to go there, of course, with every question, we've got to go a little bit backward, and we've got to go into this concept of power and control dynamics. So let's talk about power for a moment. Power is a shifting. Power is a concept. It's actually not a real thing. It's a shifting dynamic. For example, everyone has a sense of power at certain times in their life. Yeah. So let's say you're the only employee in an organization with a specific skill and you threaten to leave and the organization wants to retain you. Well, you hold the power technically. Now, when the police pull you up, there's a thing called referred power. So they pull you up on the side of the road and they ask you, "Do you know what you did?" And you say, "No, officer, I don't know what I did." And they tell you and they refer to the law. Well, that's referred power. So the police person technically power comes from the law. So if it's just an average citizen just pulled you up and said, "Right, I'm arresting you," and there's no possible reason why they would do it, you would just tell them to go away because they have no power. So power is a concept. And when we're talking about persuasion and influence, we're talking about there's two kinds. There's a more nefarious kind, which is we'll call it manipulation. So manipulation is where someone is doing something for their own gain. So they get something out of it. And you don't get anything out of it. So when you're being manipulated, it's for their purposes only. And you are really the victim of that. Then you've got persuasion. Now, persuasion is where you feel incredibly good doing the thing you want to do because someone else helps you get there. So they use certain techniques to persuade you to really go where you want to go. So manipulation being the not good one, persuasion being, in the right context, the good one. And then you've got this thing called covert persuasion. So covert persuasion, again, we've got this not good one. It's more nefarious ends. We've got the okay one, which is more you want to get there, but you don't know how to get there, and someone's able to use certain questioning techniques or certain ways of framing things that help you make sense of it. And you go, oh, okay. Every therapist uses covert persuasion on people. So literally, you're getting there. Now, the more nefarious one is where you have no gain and it gets worse for you. And when you're being covertly persuaded in a nefarious or a not good way, you feel it. You'll feel it, but you can't quite put your finger on it. And that's how you know it's just something that's going on here that you're not quite comfortable about. And the situation in the movie or the screenplay is where, of course, Priestley is covertly moving Alexander towards something that he gets gain from that. What's the gain? Well, I don't know if Jeremy wants to reveal what the gain is there, but he has a gain.
Not yet.
And of course, it's all about him. So really, there's a narcissistic element here. Narcissism really means that the person, it's all about them all the time. They're completely self-absorbed, self-centered, and they gain, usually it's an emotional gain, or it can be a physical gain, but they gain something from the interaction, from the persuasion. However, someone with PTSD, for example, might not be a narcissist. They might be just very, very much self-absorbed when they're distressed, but at other times, they have empathy and compassion. So this pop psychology idea of, oh, they're a narcissist is not actually correct. It's a diagnosable condition, and only specific people can be called actual narcissists. So other people might have narcissistic. In a way, we all have narcissistic tendencies because everything's about us. It's about us all the time, really. At the end of the day, well, look at the toilet paper crisis of 2019. Very rational people were hoarding toilet paper. Why? It became about them because there was a crisis, and we could go on and on and on about the crises in the world now. So, in reality, this covert persuasion is a way that a person can manipulate, if they're on I'll call them the dark side of the force. They manipulate this person into speaking, acting, thinking, being what they want. And they're, let's say that cult leaders, for example, are perfect examples of people who do this. They do it maybe to a group of people where they get some form of gain, some form of something out of that relationship, whether it be physical, mental, emotional, financial, cultural, spiritual, or sexual, or all of the above. And some people who do this are very hidden because it's a very complicated area. But basically, as I said, we have these habits and patterns. And what if a person was able to literally insert themselves into your habits and patterns and slowly but surely influence you to move a certain way and develop other habits and patterns that go against your intrinsic nature? Now, for the audience out there, look at anything from Darren Brown, any of his large works around covert persuasion influence, where he's convinced people to, I think, rob a bank, things like that.
Yeah,
So,
you're right. One of my favorite ones is taking people to, I think, over the course of 2 weeks with enough he's got little developments to it, and they rob a bank truck, and that what I was leads really well to what I wanted to ask you is that, talk to me about that gradual progression in the covert manipulation process, because it's not like, I meet you and then 5 minutes later ask you to rob a bank or commit murder, let's say, or whatever it might be. I imagine there's this gradual changing behavior and leading them towards more nefarious acts. Is that fair to say, David?
Yes, it is. I mean, I'm a bit of a myth buster, and and I'm also, as I've said before, I've studied hypnosis and etc. and things like that. Everyone is actually hypnotized. Every time you look at a phone and you have focus concentration on something, you're actually in a susceptible state. You're in a suggestible state. Yeah. So that's why these advertisers love it when you scroll through things and you take on that information and suddenly it pops out the other end somewhere. So at the end of the day, all of us are susceptible to being influenced. There's no one on this planet that I know that's not susceptible to it. The difference is whether you recognize it or not. So if someone's using, say, covert language patterns, I will recognize that. I will absolutely pick that up and go, that person's trying something on. However, if you're not aware of it, slowly but surely over time and exposure, you can start to be influenced, in this area. And I've done this stuff with my students to prove to them that this can be done. I had a student that I convinced to eat chocolate who didn't eat chocolate. Now, I did that over half an hour. However, there are techniques to do that, but those techniques, that's quite an intensive technique, and this person knew that I was doing that. But even though they knew I was doing it, they still did the thing that they were to be influenced for. And so the reality is we're all influencing each other all the time. It just depends on intention. Intention is the key. If I have a good intention and you come to me and you want to reduce your anxiety, sure, we can do that. And I will certainly use language patterns and questioning techniques and things to help you in that aim. However, someone like Priestley, for example, the whole intention is to gain something at the end of it, and it's not pleasant. And that kind of I guess level of influence does need to happen over a period of time. So there has to be exposure over time. Yeah, it's very rare that someone can be the Manchurian candidate in 5 minutes. The bottom line is it's got to happen systematically and over time, and that is really where not everyone will become what the other person wants them to be either. Not everyone is going to eventually be someone's influenced by someone to maybe say do something nefarious. There's a percentage of people who are more likely to be more prone to influence than others. Basically, if you have your eye out for it, you're very unlikely to get influenced. But most people don't have their eye out for it every day. But if you're someone who is just aware of what people do, what they say, how they do it, how they say it, you're less likely to be influenced. If someone is not like that, is not aware, then they're probably more likely to be influenced. So it is a process. And in this context of this movie, that process is well underway.
Yeah, of course. And you gave the example of convincing someone who doesn't eat chocolate to eat chocolate. Not you specifically, but is there a possibility that you can be convinced to do something that you wouldn't normally do through covert influence?
Now, I'm going to bust a myth here. Absolutely, you can. Absolutely, you can. This is not this stuff. Agencies in certain governments have been doing this for years. And I'm not a conspiracy theorist at all. I'm just practically in the field of persuasion influence. So, yes, you can. And I know people in this world that can do that and have that ability. Yes. However,
Yeah.
certain elements must be in play. Certain conditions must be there before that can be done. It's not something where you can generally just walk into a room, snap your fingers and say, right, sleep, follow me.
Yeah.
Doesn't work like
Yeah.
that generally.
Yeah, and on those conditions, I imagine one of them because if we take the example of Professor Priestley and Alexander, he's it's a teacher student dynamic. So that's going back to what you were saying before. There's that power dynamic at play. I imagine is that one of those elements you're talking about that or conditions? And what are some of the other conditions that you would expect there to be? And do they all need to be there?
We call it frame control, and frame control is basically when you are intending to persuade someone to do something, you set up the elements of that frame. So it'd be like, you might set up the room, for example, in a certain way. You'll wear certain clothing. You'll say certain words. You might emphasize certain words. You might use a certain tone of voice. You might have a certain area that they are. You might change the temperature. For example, if I want people to give me better evaluations in workshops, I always give them coffee, chocolate, and I raise the temperature a little bit because the warmer the temperature, the warmer they are towards me. And you can look this up. This is validated scientifically. So I will change elements around in the context of what I'm doing, so that people will be more likely to absorb the information I'm giving. For example, I'll make it 50% comedy, 50% learning, because people learn better when they're laughing, joking, and having fun. We learn better through joy and pleasure rather than pain. However, there is a very big school on creating pain, and in our areas of nefarious interrogation and all of that. That area is creating fear and pain. And then there's other areas where you befriend someone, like good cop, bad cop is literally comes out of the night. Actually, it started in about 1912, I think, in the police force, where they started to realize that people had certain motivators that would motivate them, certain emotional things motivated them. And that was expanded by, I believe, Chase Hughes. However, the original persuasion influence techniques of good cop, bad cop came out very early on, when they realized that people had certain things that motivate them, and if you provide the right motivators, you're providing a large element for persuasion. So yes, there are many different motivators, and the very good persuader will know the motivators and set up the scene or set up the situation to their advantage if possible. There's so much in this. It's a very big field.
Yeah, no, clearly it sounds like there's a lot of elements to it, in moving parts, and it gives me, just even as you're speaking, like I'm picturing a lot of things. That's how it relates to, yeah, to the screenplay again with Professor Precy and that dynamic there. We could go on talking a lot about this, David, but I'm conscious of your time, and I think that's a good way for us to wrap up on that topic. But before we do, you're mentioning from the outset a bit about um, your books that are currently available. Can you tell us a bit more about that? And there's some people who might have listened to this conversation that would want to learn more about those profiles. So if you don't mind just telling us a bit more about those.
Yeah, I was asked by years ago by students to write down how I understood human beings, how I was able to read them, and in reality, that turned into my profiling system that I developed for very quickly reading people. And when I was doing the dating and relationship stuff with people, I would teach them how to read someone fairly quickly, what kind of profile they would be in order to work out whether they might be a good match for you or not. So really, it's like a lot of people go out with the same person with a different face, and a lot of people repeat old habits and patterns based on these default mode settings. So what I did was I took all of that information and developed these profiles, my different profile sets, like my queens, my charmers, my wolves, my wily wolves, my electras, and my subtles, my turbos. There's about, all up, there's actually about 16 profiles. So 16 human adaptations in relationships that you generally will have. You'll have a default mode setting, which is your primary profile developed between the age of 0 to 5. Then you'll start to have other adaptations after that. So what these books are is they're available online. You can get them on Amazon, Kobo, all good booksellers online, Smashwords, intimate partner profiles, they're called, or hidden nature intimate partner profiles. You look up my name, David Szczecinski, and you will find them online there. They're nice and cheap. Each profile is a volume. So you can find your profile and work out, if that's you, is this my match? Who is my match? So the each volume will tell you. But it was really a way for me to work out really quickly in situation while I'm standing there, is this person going to be worth, having that conversation with or not? Is there a likelihood that you will connect with this person or not? Is there a likelihood that you will be more than Mr. and Mrs. right now? Maybe you'll be Mr. and Mrs. now and forever. So at the end of the day, as a coach, it was on me to make some of those, those evaluations, very quick assessments. Now I could do that myself because I'd learned to do that. I'd taught myself. However, it was very hard to teach my students to do that. So that's what the profiles are. They're there to help make these assessments on your prospective partner, or to get to know the partner you're with. And some people, you might want to know, like my calculating profiles. So that's all our more nefarious profiles. But that's the profiling system, and it's available online. Absolutely.
Amazing. Yeah. So it sounds like you developed them as a way for you to, as a tool to use yourself, and now you've been able to share it with, first your students, and now it's available to everyone. So that's really wonderful.
Yeah, that's what I did, because I was asked to, and it took 5 years to do that. It was 5 years of work to get them published, and there's still hidden profiles. There's 4 hidden profiles that people have that are, you just don't know. That's why I call it hidden nature, because really I'm looking biologically at how you might be likely to do something, say something, act in a certain way based on your habits and patterns, based on your biology. And we've got people who actually break the rules, and there's 4 kinds of rule breakers out there biologically. So they're but they have not been published yet. They'll be published in a separate book, actually, because they need more attention.
Well, we look forward to those when they're released. I can attest. Obviously, I've read, I think, 2 volumes. I've read the Calculating and the Queens, and I've still yet to read the others. So I look forward to doing that. I know a Turbo who might be watching this live right now. So maybe he can fill us in on that. But yeah, listen, Dave, I just want to say, thanks again for coming on. I really appreciate it, and also appreciate all the amazing work you've done so far to get to Capo to where it is now. And we look forward to obviously continuing that work as we move into production. So yeah, really appreciate you and all the work you've done.
Thank you, Jeremy, and I appreciate the opportunity you've given me. It's a wonderful opportunity, and it's a really interesting script, and it's a really interesting movie that has all of those elements in it that will keep you guessing and keep you on your seat, on the edge of that seat,
actually. Amazing. Awesome. Thanks so much, David. Yeah, I'm just gonna close off the stream there. But just for those who are watching, again, I'd more or less close this off the same way. Just if you've enjoyed this conversation, feel free to share it around, and be sure to, wherever you're watching this, subscribe or follow, because this is an ongoing series. So we do this roughly every other day of the week to fill people in. And I've enjoyed having David on, so I imagine I might get more guests on in the future, because it's been a really, really interesting chat so far, David. But on that note, you all have a wonderful long weekend. It is, wherever you may be, and hope you enjoy it with your friends and family. Thanks very much.